What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where every single Monday I, Graham, Gius, and Matthews break down all the original programming I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking Unfiltered with Renee Young, the Chris Jericho episode from November 16th, 2016. I said last week I wasn't really sure. The last episode went up on Friday, by the way. Last week was super fucking busy. I'm pretty much done with all that. I mean, this week will be a bit busy as well, but not quite as busy as the past 2 weeks. So everything should be up on time and as scheduled this upcoming week on the YouTube channel. But I did make mention on Friday that going forward, with nothing really scheduled on the WWE Network, like no new content, other than the Mae Young Classic, which I'll talk about in a second, I'll be going back and reviewing old episodes of old shows like Unfiltered and really whatever else you want me to review. If you have any suggestions, be sure to shoot me a tweet or a Facebook message, whatever, letting me know what you want me to talk about. Like if it's something like the Monday Night War show or a season of Total Divas or something like that, I really don't ordinarily go out of my way to watch like a random episode but not watch the whole series. So maybe at some point I'll like binge watch an entire season of Total Divas or the entire Monday Night War show and then like put up maybe not like one review, like one long review. Maybe that might be better as opposed to like individual episode reviews. I'm not really sure. Whatever you think would be better. But for a show like this, when I have like a random review to talk about, I really just go to Unfiltered and shows like that because it's always entertaining. Renee Young had great guests, and yes, it is past tense because the show has since ended, unfortunately. And also because I just met Chris Jericho yesterday, which I'll talk about on Friday in the random video blog, but super fucking cool, one of the greatest of all time, one of my favorites of all time, one of my biggest inspirational icons as well. So I'll talk about that Friday, but I was in a Chris Jericho mood, obviously, so I figured I would talk about the Chris Jericho edition of Unfiltered from late last year, which I enjoyed at the time and enjoyed watching back this morning. Also, speaking of the Mae Young Classic, quick note here, I am not going to be talking about the show. I mean, I talked about the bracketology, edition, installment, whatever, the special that went up on, Monday, I think, of last week or after SummerSlam, whatever. I watched it late last week. I won't be talking about the matches themselves here on the show, but I will be talking about them on nextairwrestling.net. I'll be reviewing each match in the tournament. I think the first 4 episodes already went up. I already watched the first 2. I've yet to put up the reviews yet. They should be up sometime today before I have to take off for class later. But check out those when you get a chance. I will not be talking about them here on the channel, but I will be reviewing every match, every episode that goes up. Again, the first 4 episodes are already up via on-demand content on the WWE Network. And those are the first round matches. I think next week are the quarterfinals, and then the semifinals / the finals will go up. Excuse me. Will be airing live, I think, on the WWE Network after SmackDown in a few weeks on September 12th. But anyway, let's talk about what you guys came here for. Unfiltered with Chris Jericho from November 16th, 2016. Before she sat down with Chris Jericho, Renee Young talked to Jon Stewart at SummerSlam last year, who was present at the event, for a quick Q&A. Nothing too serious, really just some fun back and forth. She asks him, some hilarious questions like, which superstar on the roster you think that you would that would borrow money from you but not pay you back? And he says John Cena. She asks him, what superstar in the roster would you have write the foreword to your book? And he said Cesaro. He seems much more intellectual than he might come off as, which is actually kind of true. Cesaro seems like he'd be a reader, an intellectual type. He asks her, or she asks him rather, which superstars would your son Nate hang out with? And he said Finn Balor and Seth Rollins. So I guess he was pretty torn. This is how you know that it was taped at SummerSlam, because he said that his son was torn as to who should win the Universal Championship match. And at that point, it had not yet happened. Obviously, Balor won, but that was his answer. What superstar would be most likely to get a late night show? And he said Dolph Ziggler, which also kind of makes sense, but at the same time, I don't know. I just don't find Ziggler funny. I think he'd be good at stand-up, which I know he's done in the past, but from what I've seen of him, he's not that good. But it's a logical answer, though. We go from there to Renee Young talking about having Emma be her enforcer and getting Chris Jericho on the show, since Jericho was very outspoken, I guess might be the right word, on Twitter about not doing Renee Young's show. He eventually gave in, he eventually caved and sat down with Renee Young for a great conversation. They talk about quite a few things here. Obviously, in addition to not wanting to do the show, one of the beefs that Jericho has with Renee Young in storyline is that she was able to get Harrison Ford on her show, and Chris Jericho has yet to do so on his podcast. I'm sure they had Harrison Ford like he was forced to do it. It was one of those sit-down interviews while they were doing the press conference and shit for the new Star Wars movie that came out 2 years ago, Episode 7. And they talk a bit about Harrison Ford for a minute and how he's infamous for not wanting to do interviews and how he's like intentionally bad doing interviews, which is pretty funny. And probably explains why he has yet to do Chris Jericho's podcast. But the new Star Wars movie is out later this year. It's out in a few months, so maybe around that point in time, Jericho can get Harrison on a show. Might not be the greatest interview, but I'm sure it can't be much worse than the Mike Tyson interview he did a couple weeks ago. Jericho was great, but Mike Tyson is not a very verbal person. He's not much of a talkative person, so the interview was very short. He had a lot of just one-word answers, and his answers and responses were very brief. But anyway, so they talk about Harrison Ford. They talk about Iron Maiden and Jericho's relationship with the band. Renee Young asks Jericho what the first concert he ever went to was, and he said The Police in 1983. She said, "Did you ever have difficulty trying to choose between being a wrestler and a rock star early on in your life?" And he said he never had to choose. He always knew he wanted to do both. And people would mock him for it. They would chastise him. They would say, "You can't do both, let alone one. Why do you think you could be a wrestler and a rock star?" And the timing of this is so timely. Terrible phrasing, but the timing of this is so perfect because on the way home last night, after meeting Chris Jericho, I was reading his new book, which you had to purchase in order to meet him. And he was talking about just that, about people telling him that he could not do both. He ended up doing both. And that, he never really had to choose, and that people telling him he can't do one or the other really just fuels him more to do it. He talks about what songs Fozzy would cover since they're not really a cover band. I guess they covered SOS by, ABBA? I think it's ABBA. SOS by ABBA. I think they covered that. I think I've heard that before, too, and they actually did a damn good job of it. I know he played it on his podcast a few years ago. They go from there to obligatory Canadian content, as Renee Young calls this section of the show. She says, a lot of this stuff you might not have any idea about. I know I sure didn't. But she says, favorite Bryan Adams song. I have no idea who that is. Who should have been bigger? Like what Canadian band or star or whatever should have been bigger than they were. The Tragically Hip. Again, have no idea who they are either. Guess they're just a band or something from many years ago. They never really broke out. Hottest Canadian, Renee Young asked Jericho. I was half expecting him to say like himself or something as a heel, but he actually gave the straightforward answer and saying Pamela Anderson, which is not a bad answer at all. And then she asks him, current day or from like 20 years ago? And he says, either way, which is hard to disagree with. She is still pretty good looking even, all these years later. And he also says Jim Carrey, too, was also not bad looking back in the day from like 20 years or so ago. So they talk about, she asks him if he can name all the members of the show Kids in the Hall. Have, again, no idea what the show is. I've never seen an episode of it. He does say, though, that one of the episodes, or rather one of the cast members, Scott Thompson, was actually in his little web series that came out about 4 years ago. I've seen every episode. But I'm Chris Jericho is what it's called. Go to butimchrisjericho.com to check it out. But I'm Chris Jericho. Really, really funny stuff. Again, they talk about like Canadians being in sketch shows and how they're not really funny to Americans. And this kind of has a Canadian flavor to it. But I thought it was really funny. I thought Jericho played his role really well. And there were other guys and girls in the show, like Scott Thompson, who I thought were very funny as well. So definitely check that out when you get a chance. They do show clips of it here on the show. They talk about connecting at the Stones show, at a Stones concert, many years ago or something. I guess Jericho took Renee Young's scarf. And Renee Young repays the favor by giving her one of her own scarves, or a new scarf, whatever, as a gift. Jericho is very thankful and appreciative of the scarf at the end of this episode. And they kind of make amends, and Jericho and Renee Young are finally one. They are finally friends, it appears, at the end of this episode of Unfiltered. So this episode in total is about 19 minutes, but it just breezes by. I mean, Jericho's so great. Renee Young is awesome as a host. A lot of what they talk about is really just about music and Canadian stuff, but the funny thing is that they have such great chemistry, and both of them are so fucking entertaining that it really doesn't matter what they're talking about. You're just engaged, and it's compelling content. So if you're expecting like some hard-hitting answers, some groundbreaking shit from Chris Jericho about his wrestling career. You're not going to get it here. It's a lot about music, but they both know what they're talking about, and it's very entertaining to hear them talk about music and Canadian stuff and stuff like that. So definitely check out this episode of Unfiltered with Renee Young with Chris Jericho from November of 2016. Next week, what we're talking about, I have no idea. Again, the Mae Young Classic is in the middle of airing right now. The first 4 episodes are up now. My reviews of those episodes should be up at some point this week, if not today or tomorrow, if I have the time. And I think the next 4 episodes are up next week too, which means there's going to be no new content, I think, after Raw next Monday night. So, that being said, we'll find another episode of some show on the WWE Network to talk about right here on WWE Network and Chill. But in the meantime, and in between time, guys, be sure to find me on the Twitter machine at WrestleRant and follow me there. Find me on Facebook at facebook.com/graham.gsm.matthews. And be sure to support the channel as well by liking this video, dropping a comment, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel for daily content. I'm Graham GSM Matthews. Have a great rest of your week, guys, and I'll catch your ass down the road.